Imagine living in a Rome where power was measured not only by the sword, but also by the gold one possessed. Among glorious generals and shrewd politicians, one name stood out for different reasons: Marcus Licinius Crassus. He wasn't just wealthy, he was the richest man in all of Rome. Owner of silver mines, vast estates, and countless slaves, Crassus had amassed a fortune so immense that he could single-handedly finance entire military campaigns and even rescue the state when the public treasury ran dry. But behind all that golden brilliance, a growing shadow lurked, boundless, and Crassus could not bear the thought of being seen merely as Rome's banker, the man who bought power instead of earning it through blood and glory. From a young age, Crassus displayed a cold, calculating. During the civil wars that tore the Republic apart, he learned that the misfortune of others could become the foundation of his fortune. When the houses of the enemies of the state were confiscated, Crassus bought the properties for next to nothing and resold them later at outrageous profit. Over time, he built a real estate empire in the heart of Rome. His fame grew, but so did the contempt of many. To the senators and generals, he was the man of easy money, the merchant of human tragedy. But Crassus wanted more. He wanted to be remembered as a hero, a conqueror, a new Alexander. Wealth was no longer enough. He craved respect, applause, and the recognition that only military victory could bring. That hunger for glory placed him in sharp contrast with the other two members of the First Triumvirate: Pompey, the great strategist who had cleansed the Mediterranean of pirates and expanded Rome's borders, and Julius Caesar, the political and military genius who captivated the crowds and wrote his own legend in the forests of Gaul. Between these two titans, Crassus felt small, almost ridiculous. He was the third man of the alliance, the financial pillar that sustained the others, but without the charisma or the battles. The crowds chanted Caesar's name. The Senate revered Pompey. But who celebrated Crassus? No one. That wound to his pride corroded him from within like rust on precious metal. He began to believe that only war could wash away his silent humiliation. Despite being 60 years old, Crassus still saw himself as a man destined. He believed the gods had granted him fortune for something greater than banquets and palaces. Slowly, that belief turned into obsession. He could no longer bear to watch Caesar's triumphal parades or the honors showered upon Pompey. In every cheer, he heard a cruel reminder of his inferiority, and so he decided he would have his own triumph, no matter the cost. His advisors warned him about the dangers of seeking glory on distant battlefields. But Crassus did not listen. In his mind, gold was as powerful a shield as any legion. He believed he could buy victory, just as he had bought everything else in life. That belief, that money could replace military wisdom, would mark the beginning of. Crassus viewed war as an investment. Where others saw risk, he saw opportunity. And with that merchant's mindset, he began to plan his greatest gamble: a military campaign against the Parthian Empire, a vast and wealthy kingdom to the east, in the arid lands between the Euphrates and the Indus. It was said that gold gleamed in its temples and that the silk and spice routes made its coffers overflow. For a man obsessed with wealth and recognition, this seemed the perfect chance to unite both worlds, that of power and that of glory. But before departing, Crassus tried to strengthen his image in Rome. He sponsored lavish spectacles, bought votes, and distributed coins to them, all to maintain the illusion that he was a benefactor of the Republic. The truth, however, was that Rome viewed him with suspicion. Everyone knew that behind his generosity lay calculation. Crassus longed for love, but only knew how to buy it. He wanted respect, but inspired only fear. Deep down, he believed destiny owed him a victory, and that belief, fed by years of envy, made him blind to the fact that glory and wealth rarely coexist in harmony. While Caesar conquered hearts and Pompey accumulated victory, Crassus prepared to conquer the impossible and unknowingly marched toward his ruin. The story of Crassus is a perfect portrait of how ambition, when it exceeds reason, turns virtue into vice. His intelligence, which had once made him rich, became arrogance. His self-confidence, once inspiring, turned into blindness, and his quest for respect made him an object of shame. The richest man of the ancient world failed to understand that some treasures can never be bought, especially glory. And it is precisely at this point that the next chapter of this story begins. The moment when Crassus decides to turn his dream into action and set out toward the east to face the mighty Parthian Empire. A journey that, instead of leading him to eternity, would bring him to the cruelest end Rome had ever witnessed. After years of being seen only as the man of money, Marcus Licinius Crassus believed that fate was finally giving him a chance to change his story. He did not want to die remembered as Rome's banker, the dealer of properties and slaves, the man who bought influence. He wanted to be remembered as a conqueror, and so his eyes turned eastward, toward the vast and mysterious Parthian Empire, a land of desert and gold, of caravans laden with silk and spices, and of kings shrouded in lead. Parthia seemed the perfect place for Crassus to carve his name into eternity. In his mind, the plan was simple: march, conquer, and return covered in glory. The reality, however, would be very different. When Crassus presented his proposal for invasion to the Senate, the elders were alarmed. They knew Parthia was not an easy enemy. It was a consolidated empire with powerful armies and skilled commanders. Moreover, Rome had no legitimate reason to declare war. No insults, no threats. It was a war driven purely by the greed and pride of one man who wanted to prove something to himself. But Crassus would not accept no for an answer. When the Senate refused to approve the campaign officially, he simply ignored. Using his wealth and influence, he gathered the resources on his own, hired soldiers, bought weapons, secured supplies, and in 55 BCE named himself governor of Syria, a position that granted him military and strategic autonomy. From that moment on, he began planning what he imagined would be his triumphant march. The thought of facing Parthia filled Crassus with enthusiasm. When he looked at the map, those immense stretches of sand and mountains did not appear as obstacles, but as golden roads leading to glory. He believed the discipline of the Roman legions would be enough to crush any Eastern army. After all, Rome had defeated far larger and more savage peoples before. What could possibly go wrong? In his mind, victory was only a matter of time. And of course, investment. Crassus financed everything with his own gold and expected in return not just more riches, but the respect he had always been denied. He dreamed of a triumph in Rome, people chanting his name, the Senate recognizing his worth, Caesar and Pompey forced to admire him as an equal. That dream, however, blinded him. The most experienced generals warned him about the dangers of the desert, the tactics of the Parthian cavalry, and the difficulty of maintaining supply lines in such a distant campaign. Crassus, however, took every piece of advice as an insult. He called the prudent cowards and believed that Roman faith alone would secure victory. In 55 BCE, he arrived in Syria and immediately began preparations for invasion. He ordered the recruitment of 7 legions, about 40,000 soldiers, along with thousands of cavalry and auxiliary archers. It was one of the largest expeditionary forces Rome had ever assembled. The cities of Syria watched in fear as Crassus's power became a spectacle. Columns of men marching under the sun, catapults and siege towers rising, Roman standards fluttering in the desert. Everything suggested greatness, but also hubris. Meanwhile, the local rulers tried to warn him. Allied princes, regional governors, and even seasoned merchants cautioned him about the Parthian way of war. They were not undisciplined barbarians, but skilled horsemen with powerful bows capable of killing from afar. Their tactics were unlike anything Rome had ever faced. Crassus heard them, but did not listen. To him, victory was inevitable. His confidence only grew when he received reports that the Parthian king, Orodes II, was dealing with internal revolts in other parts of the empire. It seemed the perfect time to strike. The enemy appeared weak. What he did not know was that these reports had been carefully planted by Parthian agents who wanted to lure him into a trap. But Crassus, blinded by ambition, suspected nothing. In the spring of 53 BCE, he crossed the Euphrates River, the natural border between Roman and Parthian land. The crossing was celebrated as a great moment. Crassus believed it the first step on a glorious journey. With each village conquered, with each small triumph, the illusion of inevitable victory grew stronger. The Roman people, hearing the initial news, began to believe that Crassus was about to bring back more gold than Caesar had ever brought from. But the Mesopotamian desert does not forgive arrogance. As his troops advanced, the heat became unbearable, supplies ran short, and the soldiers began to grumble. The long marches over barren terrain, the ambushes by small bands of enemy riders, and the haunting silence of the nights began to eat away at the legion's morale. Still, Crassus refused to retreat. He insisted that victory was near, and that any hesitation would be seen as weakness. The presence of his son, Publius Crassus, a brave young commander admired by Caesar, only deepened his determination. Crassus wanted to prove to his son that he was worthy of the family. He wanted to leave him not only wealth, but a legacy of glory. That blend of paternal pride and personal ambition blinded him completely. He no longer saw the desert, nor the danger, nor the clear signs that he was being led toward ruin. He saw only what he wanted to see, a golden road leading to eternity. The invasion of Parthia was not merely a military operation. It was a personal gamble. Crassus risked everything, his fortune, his reputation, even his life, believing he could buy destiny itself. But destiny is not for sale, and history would prove it in the most brutal way imaginable. And so, the richest man in Rome, burdened by the weight of his own ambitions, began marching ever deeper into unknown land. What he did not know was that beyond the horizon, a young Parthian general named Surena was waiting, ready to teach Rome a lesson that would echo through the century. When Marcus Licinius Crassus crossed the Euphrates and set foot on the sands of Mesopotamia, he believed he was marching toward an easy victory. But on the other side of the desert, a man watched him with cold patience. His name was Surena, the young commander of the Parthian army, a strategist as elegant as he was ruthless. He was only 30 years old, yet his reputation already preceded him. A noble warrior descended from one of Parthia's oldest families, Surena mastered the art of turning the desert itself into a weapon. While Crassus saw an open field waiting to be conquered, Surena saw a chessboard where every grain of sand could be used against the enemy. From the very beginning, Surena understood something crucial. The Romans did not understand the terrain. They came from a civilization that relied on roads, tight formations, and geometric discipline. But the desert does not obey geometry. It changes with every breath of wind. The dunes hide ambush, the heat turns armor into a burden, and thirst is as deadly as any sword. Surena knew that if he tried to face the Romans in open combat, the legions might prevail through strength and organization. So he chose another path, not to fight, at least not in the way his enemies expected. The Parthian strategy was simple yet brilliant. Lure the Roman army deeper and deeper into the desert, cutting them off from water and supplies until the environment itself began to destroy them. Meanwhile, the Parthian horsemen, light, swift, and deadly, would do the rest. They were masters of mobility. Their composite bows could shoot at unbelievable distance, and they could fire even while retreating, executing the dreaded Parthian shot, a maneuver that confused and infuriated their enemy. Crassus failed to see the game being played. Each time his scouts encountered small groups of Parthian riders, he believed he was facing a weak and scattered enemy. He ordered his troops to pursue the fleeing cavalry, convinced that victory was near. But those chases never ended. The enemy would vanish over the horizon, only to reappear later, taunting them. And so, the Romans marched without rest, under a merciless sun, dragging their heavy armor and carrying banners that shimmered like mirrors in the desert. By day, the heat was unbearable. By night, the cold cut like knives. The desert seemed alive, mocking the invader. Surena used the land itself as his ally, cutting supply routes, attacking convoys, and letting fear do the rest. The Romans began hearing strange sounds in the darkness, distant galloping, war cries, arrows whistling from nowhere. Many started to believe that the desert gods themselves were against them. The psychological warfare was perhaps Surena's most brutal weapon. He didn't just want to win. He wanted to break the Roman spirit. He sent small detachments to appear on the horizon, just visible enough to be noticed. When the Romans prepared for battle, the Parthians vanished among the dunes, leaving no trace. This tactic repeated for days. Crassus's soldiers began to doubt everything: their orders, their maps, even their commander. Each march grew slower, each rest more anxious. The army that once moved in disciplined silence now muttered prayers and curses. The water reserves ran dangerously low. Sandals burned their feet, armor seared under the sun, and shadows became precious treasures. All the while, Surena watched from afar, patient and calm. He knew he was winning without ever needing a pitched battle. The desert was his invisible ally, and every Roman step was another into the trap. Crassus, however, would not show weakness. Even as his most experienced officers urged retreat, he saw their warnings as insults to his authority. Pride was his greatest enemy. When reports came that the main Parthian army was in retreat, he believed his long-awaited moment of triumph had arrived. Surena had set the stage perfectly, spreading rumors that King Orodes had fled and that the Parthian forces were in disarray. Even the desert itself seemed to conspire to feed the illusion. And so, instead of turning back, Crassus advanced farther, leading 40,000 men. Soldiers exhausted, dehydrated, and mentally broken. In the weeks that followed, the invisible noose tightened. The Parthian cavalry attacked by day and disappeared by night. Arrows rained from every direction, and the enemy was never seen clearly. The Romans tried to regroup, but the heat and fatigue made it impossible to hold formation. The standards, symbols of Roman pride, now seemed like useless burdens in the sand. Some soldiers began hallucinating, seeing mirages of rivers and distant cities. Despair spread like wildfire, and that was exactly what Surena wanted: an enemy tired, demoralized, and dying of thirst. Only then did he decide to reveal his true strength. He ordered his forces to surround the Romans near Carrhae, a small oasis town Crassus believed to be safe. But what seemed like a refuge would become the stage for total destruction. As the legions began setting up camp, the silence of the desert was shattered by the thunder of drums, war cries, and horses. The ground trembled beneath the charge of the Parthian cavalry. It was the beginning of the true battle, one that Crassus would never understand. The Roman general did not know it yet, but this would be the last sunset he would ever see with confidence. Sharena's plan was complete. The desert had done the hard work. Now it was time to reap the harvest. And that harvest would be drenched in. The June sun burned over the horizon when Marcus Licinius Crassus decided that this would be the day of glory. Before his 40,000 men, the desert of Carrhae seemed like the final obstacle between him and eternal fame. After weeks of exhausting marches, the general believed the enemy was finally cornered. Ahead, the Parthian forces shimmered in the distance. Crassus thought the moment had come to prove that Rome was still invincible. He had no idea he was about to step in the deadliest trap of it. On the other side of the field, the young Parthian commander Serena watched calmly. He knew every detail of the terrain, every dune, every gust of wind. While the Roman army arranged itself into rigid formations, Serena smiled. He knew that Rome's strength was also its greatest weakness. The flat, arid ground would become the perfect stage for Parthia's cavalry. And the clear blue sky would soon turn into a storm of air. Crassus positioned his legions in a square, heavy infantry in the center, and cavalry on the flank. It was a classic formation, the symbol of Roman discipline. At the front, his son Publius Crassus commanded the right wing. Young, brave, impetuous, and determined to prove himself worthy of his father's name. Armor gleamed beneath the sun, and the rhythmic pounding of shields echoed like a single heartbeat. The men believed they would win, but the silence of the desert was shattered by a strange sound, a growing roar that came from afar. It was the synchronized gallop of thousands of horses. Then came the first metallic thunder, Parthian arrows flying like a storm. They came in endless waves, fast and merciless, hissing through the air like swarms of bees. Within minutes, the sky darkened. The legions raised their shields, forming the famous testudo, the tortoise formation. But even then, the arrows pierced through the gaps, tearing through flesh, metal, and pride. The Romans waited for the attack to stop, for the Parthian archers to run out of arrows, but it never happened. Shareina had prepared something Rome had never seen before, an army of mounted archers with an endless supply of ammunition. Caravans of camels continuously delivered fresh quivers, ensuring the deadly rain would never cease. It was a symphony of destruction. While the Romans shielded themselves, the Parthians would retreat, reload, and return, always staying just beyond the reach of Roman spears. Each passing hour, the Roman formation grew more chaotic. The soldiers sweated under the heat, blood dripped down their shields, the sand turned red. Crassus shouted orders, but the distance and noise made command impossible. Then Publius, seeing his men's morale collapsing, made a fatal decision. Without waiting for his father's command, he gathered the cavalry and charged boldly toward the Parthian center. His goal was to break the encirclement and turn the tide, but he rode straight into Serena's trap. The Parthian horsemen pretended to flee, luring Publius and his men deep into the desert. There, they surrounded them on all sides. The sound of arrows returned, closer now, deadlier. The Roman horses stumbled in the sand, while the Parthian archers, swift and precise, attacked in circles, staying just out of reach. Publius fought valiantly, but he knew it was useless. The heavy Roman lances were powerless against an enemy that refused to be caught. The battle became a massacre. As the sun began to set, young Publius was surrounded. His spear was broken, his shield riddled with arrows. The remaining soldiers closed ranks around him, trying to protect their commander's son. It is said that, realizing capture was inevitable, Publius chose death. He charged an enemy head-on, offering his chest to the blade. He fell silently, and with him, the last breath of Roman hope that, when Serena learned that Crassus's son was dead, he saw the chance to strike not just a military blow, but a psychological. He ordered Publius's head to be severed, and in a chilling gesture, had it mounted on a spear. When the Parthian archers resumed their assault, they carried it toward the Roman line. The impact was devastating. The legions, already exhausted and disoriented, froze in horror at the sight. The familiar face of their commander's son now turned into a trophy. The silence that followed was worse than any scream. Crassus stood still, staring. His face hardened. The officers around him tried to urge him to act, but he seemed petrified. The pride that had brought him there had now turned into despair. Roman morale collapsed. The soldiers began to fall back, breaking formation. Arrows rained mercilessly. Cries of pain echoed through the dunes, and the desert seemed to swallow every sound, every hope. The glory Crassus had sought so desperately now crumbled before his eyes, along with his army and his name. Shareina, satisfied, was in no hurry. He ordered the encirclement to continue, and the Romans to be slowly driven toward Carrhae, where they would be annihilated completely. The Parthian commander knew he was not just fighting a battle. He was building a legend. Crassus, emotionally destroyed, tried to reorganize what little remained of his forces, but fear had already conquered before the weapons. That night, no war chants or prayers were heard in the Roman camp, only the whisper of the wind and the sound of Parthian arrows being sharpened for the coming dawn. And so, in the sands of Carrhae, the richest man in Rome, everything, his army, his son, and his own. The battle that was meant to immortalize him as a hero instead turned him into a symbol of but the worst was yet to come, because for Crassus, the war was not over. When the sun rose over the dunes of Carrhae, the Roman camp was already a landscape of despair. The ground was covered with bodies, fallen shields, and broken standard. The wind blew over the silence of those who hadn't survived, and the air smelled of dust, sweat, and defeat. The man who had left Rome as the most powerful and confident figure in the Republic now watched his army crumble before his eyes. Marcus Licinius Crassus, the banker who wanted to be a hero, was surrounded not only by enemies, but by the very tragedy he had created himself. The legions, once proud and disciplined, had become a disordered mass of starving, wounded, and terrified men. The heat of the previous day had drained their strength, and the Parthian arrows had drained their hope. Crassus's orders no longer carried authority. His generals were dead, his standards captured, and his soldiers thought of only one thing: survival. The sound of Roman trumpets, once the anthem of glory, was now replaced by screams of pain and desperate prayer. When night fell, Crassus tried to reorganize what remained. He ordered the survivors to march toward Carrhae, a nearby town that might offer shelter and water. He believed they could regroup and resist there, but the desert shows no mercy. The night march quickly turned into chaos. Exhausted men collapsed, riders strayed from the group, and the wounded were left behind. Every step felt heavier. Their armor scorched their skin, their mouths were dry, and the darkness hid both enemies and illusion. The Parthians, meanwhile, watched from afar. Sharina, the commander who had orchestrated Rome's destruction with almost cruel patience, knew he didn't need to attack. Despair would do the work for him. At times, he sent small groups of horsemen to circle the Roman column, shout war cries, and fire arrows, just to remind them they were being hunted. Each ambush, more Romans deserted. The legions broke apart into small groups, losing all sense of direction. When they finally reached Carrhae, what remained of the once mighty army was unrecognizable. Of the 40,000 men who had crossed the Euphrates, fewer than half were still alive. They were disarmed, starving, and consumed by fear. Crassus entered the city in silence, bearing the weight of shame. The local citizens received him with wary eyes. They knew that sheltering a defeated army meant inviting the wrath of the Parthians. Still, they offered temporary refuge while the general decided what to do next. Inside the city walls, Crassus gathered his remaining officers. The discussions were long and tense. Some, led by Octavius and Cassius Longinus, urged him to flee during the night, cross the Euphrates, and return to Syria. Others, more desperate, argued for surrender. Crassus, exhausted and broken by his son's death, wavered between pride and reason. For a moment, he seemed ready to accept defeat, not out of cowardice, but because he knew that to persist would mean condemning everyone to death. That was when Sharina made his final move. The Parthian commander sent envoys to the city with a proposal for peace. He promised to spare the survivors if Crassus would meet him personally to negotiate the terms of withdrawal. The conditions sounded generous: guaranteed safety, a temporary truce, and permission to return to Rome. Many of Crassus's officers saw in this a chance for salvation, but others were suspicious. They knew the Parthians' reputation. They feared that a negotiation was merely a pretext to capture their general. They tried to persuade Crassus to refuse, but the man who had once defied the Senate and the gods was no longer the same. Defeat and grief had destroyed the pride that had sustained him. Crassus wanted to believe he could still save something, even if only the lives of his remaining men. And so, against all advice, he agreed to the meeting. He ordered a small escort to accompany and rode out to meet Sharina, carrying with him a fragile hope that the enemy might show mercy. The scene was tense and heavy with omen. The Romans arrived at the meeting point under white flags, their faces hollow. On the other side, Sharina appeared with almost theatrical grace, wearing ornate armor adorned with jewels, flanked by a grand escort. He greeted Crassus with apparent respect and suggested they speak on neutral ground. The Roman hesitated, then agreed. The two men approached one another, and for a brief moment, the desert seemed to hold its. Then, something happened. Accounts differ. Some say a malicious interpreter caused a misunderstanding. Others claim Sharina had planned the betrayal all along. What is certain is that words gave way to. One of the Roman officers drew his sword, and the Parthians reacted instantly. The meeting site erupted into confusion. Crassus was seized and restrained. His guards tried to fight back, but were quickly cut down. Those watching from a distance stood frozen, unsure whether to attack or flee. Within minutes, it was over. Crassus, the man who had once ruled Rome through wealth and influence, was now a prisoner of the enemy who despised his greed. Sharina observed him silently. There was no anger, only disdain. To him, this man embodied Roman arrogance, the belief that everything could be bought, even victory itself. The irony was perfect. The conqueror had fallen by trusting too much in his own cunning. When news of Crassus's capture spread, the remaining Roman forces collapsed completely. Many tried to flee, but few escaped. Hundreds were killed. Others were captured and taken as slaves to Parthian land. Carrhae, which was supposed to be a refuge, became a graveyard. The news of the disaster spread swiftly, crossing borders and reaching Rome like a thunderclap. The empire that had believed itself invincible had just suffered one of the greatest humiliations in its history. Meanwhile, in the Parthian tents, Sirena prepared the final act. His prisoner was no ordinary man. He was a symbol, and his death would need to carry the same weight as his sins. Thus, he decided that Crassus's end would be a spectacle worthy of his greed, a punishment so horrific and symbolic that it would echo through the age. And so, under the impassive gaze of the desert gods, the richest man in Rome walked toward his fate, no longer the banker, nor the general, but the prisoner who would learn, in the cruelest possible way, the true price of gold. The silence of the desert was broken only by the clinking of metal. Inside the Parthian camp, surrounded by torches flickering in the night wind, Marcus Licinius Crassus, once the richest man in Rome, awaited the verdict of his fate. His hands were bound, his face covered in dust and shame. There was no trace left of the proud general who had set out in search of glory. Before him, the cold eyes of the Parthians reflected not only hatred but contempt. To them, this man represented the worst of Rome. Arrogance, greed, and the belief that gold could buy everything, even honor. Sirena, the Parthian commander, observed the prisoner with almost solemn calm. He did not see in Crassus a military enemy, but a symbol to be destroyed. The victory at Carrhae was not enough. It needed to be turned into a message, a warning to the world. Rome would learn that ambition has a price, and that not even the purest gold can buy forgiveness. So Sirena ordered an execution worthy of the story that would be told for centuries, a punishment not only physical, but moral. The Parthians were not barbarians blinded by revenge. They understood the power of symbols. Crassus had invaded their lands not out of necessity, but out of desire. He had come to steal their gold, their trade, and their pride. Thus, they decided that gold would be the instrument of his punishment. They ordered that coins and jewels be melted, perhaps even the very treasure Crassus had brought to finance the war. The craftsmen lit the furnaces and fed the fire until the liquid metal glowed orange and red like a small sun in the hands of the executioners. Meanwhile, Crassus remained kneeling, surrounded by the warriors he had tried to underestimate. The heat of the flames illuminated his weary face. Some say he begged for mercy, others that he remained silent, accepting the inevitable. Either way, the moment carried a nearly mythical weight. The man who believed everything could be conquered with gold was about to discover the true power of the metal he had loved so much. When the gold reached its melting point, the Parthians brought the vessel before him. The molten glow reflected fire and despair. It seemed alive, pulsating. Two soldiers held him by the arms, while others forced his head back. The heat radiating from the cup was unbearable. Sirena raised his hand and, with a slow ceremonial gesture, gave the signal. The gold began to pour. The molten liquid entered Crassus's mouth, burning everything in its path, his lips, his throat, his lungs. The sound that followed was not a scream, but a muffled roar, a distant echo of pain and iron. The molten metal coursed through his body, turning the man into a living statue of agony and regret. In a few seconds, the fire of greed had become the fire of destruction. The Parthians watched in silence. No laughter, no insults. It was a ritual. Gold, the symbol of power and corruption, had turned against its worshiper. The same metal that had shaped Crassus's empire now shaped his death. For them, that moment represented divine justice, a lesson carved not in words, but in fire. When it was over, Crassus's lifeless body fell onto the hot sand. The smell of burnt metal mingled with that of the desert, creating a heavy, almost sacred atmosphere. Sirena approached slowly and looked down at the corpse. He is said to have murmured, "Now Crassus is satisfied." The phrase became legendary, repeated by chroniclers, poets, and historians as the perfect epitaph for the man who died, devoured by his own hunger for wealth. But the execution did not end there. The Parthians knew that Crassus's death had to echo beyond the sand. They ordered that his head and right hand, symbols of power and ambition, be sent to the court of King Orodes II. There, it is said, the king had them used as props in a theatrical performance where actors mocked Roman arrogance and the fall of the Lord of Gold. The face of Crassus, once feared in the Senate, became an object of ridicule and scorn in the Eastern land. In Rome, when the news arrived, the impact was devastating. The people could not believe that one of the pillars of the Triumvirate had fallen in such humiliation. The streets filled with rumors, and the Senate fell into silence. The empire, long accustomed to believing that no enemy could defeat it, now had to face the shame of seeing its richest general die with his mouth full of gold. It was more than a military, it was a moral wound. The episode became an eternal symbol of corruption and hubris. the sin of arrogance against the gods and against reason. For centuries, poets and philosophers would use Crassus's image as a metaphor, the man who fed so much on his own ambition that he was finally consumed by it. Gold, which for him had been the promise of power, became the instrument of his ruin, and ultimately a lesson about what happens when desire exceeds the limits of wisdom. Thus, in the sands of Parthia, the richest man of the ancient world met the most symbolic end imaginable. His death not only closed a life, it closed a cycle of arrogance and illusion that stained the name of Rome and opened the door to even more turbulent time. For with the fall of Crassus, the fragile alliance between Caesar and Pompey also began to crumble. Roman politics would once again be filled with intrigue, civil war, and blood, all a direct consequence of the greed of a man who tried to buy eternity. And here, the story of Crassus becomes reflection. More than a historical account, his death became a universal warning about the price of power and the poison of avarice. The fire died, the gold cooled, but the lesson still burns through the century. The death of Marcus Licinius Crassus was not merely the end of a man, it was the collapse of an era. When molten gold sealed his throat, it also melted the myth of Roman invincibility. For the first time in centuries, Rome was forced to confront the truth. The empire that believed it ruled the world was, after all, vulnerable. The sands of Carrhae did not bury only bodies and banners, but also the illusion that power and wealth were synonymous with destiny. The news of the tragedy swept across the east with the speed of the wind and struck Rome like a dagger to its pride. The Senate fell silent, the streets filled with whispers and fear. How could the richest and most influential man of the Republic fall so shameful? The shock was deep. The name of Crassus, once associated with banquets and financial triumphs, became spoken with embarrassment. His defeat became the symbol of how excessive ambition can corrode even the strongest foundations of a civilization. But the impact of his fall did not stop there. Politically, Crassus's death was the final blow to the fragile balance that had held together the most powerful alliance in Rome, the First Triumvirate. Until then, Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus had divided the world, a triumvirate of power, influence, and wealth. Crassus was the link that balanced the force. His gold funded Caesar's legions and softened tensions with Pompey. When he died, that balance collapsed. What remained was a vacuum. The vacuum of power always calls for war. Without Crassus to mediate, Caesar and Pompey turned from allies into rivals. One represented the future of the Republic in the hands of a single man. The other, the conservative pride of the Senate. Their rivalry grew until it became a civil war that tore Rome apart from. Thus, in a tragic and ironic twist, the ambition of a single man who sought only personal glory unleashed the political ruin of an entire generation. The defeat at Carrhae did not end in the desert. It echoed through the streets of Rome, in the swords of legionaries, and in the blood that would soon soak the Tiber. On a symbolic level, the legacy of Crassus transcended military history. His death became a moral fable, a lesson repeated for centuries by philosophers, writers. Plutarch wrote that Crassus died from the same poison that had nourished him. To the Romans, he embodied the sin of hubris, the excessive pride that drives man to challenge fate and be punished. To later thinkers, he became the perfect example of how greed can turn virtues into weaknesses and achievements into disgrace. Over time, the figure of Crassus took on a tragic tone. He was not a villain in the purest sense. He was human, all too human. He wanted to prove that he deserved respect and love, but he chose the wrong path to obtain. His story is the story of all who believe that power can fill the emptiness of the soul. His fortune did not save him, his army did not protect him, and his glory never came. In the end, the man who wanted to be remembered as a hero was remembered as a warning. Even centuries later, the name of Crassus still resonates as a mirror for the powerful. His fall teaches that an empire built on pride is doomed to. And, in a way, there is a little bit of Crassus in all of it. That inner voice that whispers just a little more will be enough. More money, more success, more recognition. But history shows that more is never enough. The gold of Crassus did not only kill a man, it killed an ideal. And thus, from the sands that once burned the Roman army, was born one of the greatest lessons of antiquity. Power without wisdom destroys, and ambition without limits consumes. And here, the story of Marcus Licinius Crassus comes to an end, not with glory, but with reflection. He went to war believing that gold could buy respect, but found in the flames of his own greed the price of his life is a reminder that true power lies not in accumulated riches, but in the ability to understand one's own limits. The tragedy of Crassus does not belong only to the past. It repeats itself every day in leaders, businessmen, and ordinary people who mistake success for. His story invites us to look within, to question how far we would go in the name of ambition. After all, gold that shines too brightly can blind, and victory sought at any cost can become the bitterest defeat. Rome survived, It's true, but the echo of the defeat at Carrhae forever marked its content. It was a reminder that empires do not fall only by external enemies. They crumble from within when morality bends to greed. The end of Crassus, therefore, is the end of an illusion that greatness can be. And now, if you've made it this far, I want to thank you for joining me on this journey. If you enjoyed this video, leave a like. It helps YouTube understand that this kind of historical and reflective content deserves to reach more people. And of course, subscribe to the channel. Your subscription is essential. It shows YouTube that there's an audience for well-narrated, well-researched, and carefully produced video. When you subscribe and activate the notification bell, you ensure that new episodes like this one reach you directly without relying on the algorithm's luck. Comment below, what struck you most in the story of Crassus? Was it his ambition, the irony of fate, or the cruel symbolism of death by gold? I read every comment, and I want to hear your thoughts, because every perspective gives new life to this ancient story. And before you go, don't leave just yet. Click on the video that's appearing on your screen right now. It's even more captivating and full of twists than this one. There, we'll dive into another incredible story from the ancient world, filled with lessons that still resonate today. I'm sure you'll be amazed. See you there. And remember, history never dies. It only changes its voice.